All right, everybody, welcome to Latter-day Lobster podcast. This is going to be a great episode. I can already feel it. We have Sam Fisher with us. He was one of our speakers at Latter-day Lobster conference back in, what was that, October? No, it wasn't October, was it? September.
Something like that. It was September,
Yeah,
I think. Yep, it was a
September,
while.
yeah. Yeah, well, that was such a fun event. I'm bummed I didn't get to meet you in person. I was in Seattle. I've told the story a bazillion times, but I'm glad I get to talk to you now. So one of the reasons why I wanted to do this podcast today, we've been talking about this for quite a while, but things have come up. I mean, I've been a little sick. I sound a little sniffly right now, but
Oh yeah. 'Tis the season.
yeah.
Goes along with the Christmas tree.
Yes. But so we just found out a few days ago that Jordan Peterson is coming to Salt Lake City for the second time. Yeah, I already got tickets.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I'm so excited. And then one of the things that I like about your posts in the Lobster group is you're one of the few people who is actually posting quotes from Maps of Meaning, which is a very hard book. It's like thick. I have a copy right here. I actually got I put a hardback on it. But
nice,
it's
very
thick,
nice.
And I'll show you guys. So when I saw Jordan Peterson back in 2018, I have the ticket right here, and I pasted it.
Look at that. Check that out.
Anyways, I put my own little title on it, Maps of Meaning. I got Deseret Book to do it, which is kind of ironic in a cosmic way.
Yeah, I like it. I think it's great.
So today we wanted to talk about Jordan Peterson, of course, because that's what we always talk about, but we want to talk about Maps of Meaning. This is the book he wrote before he wrote 12 Rules for Life. And it's like his, Magnus Opus, his, it's like a tour de force of a book. Like it's almost 600 pages and the text is kind of small and the pages are extra big.
Yeah.
So,
and what did it take him? Like 20 years to write that thing?
Something like that. Yeah.
I mean, he was really going over it, right? Getting the ideas and then laying out the ideas. And then when laying out the ideas, like actually presenting them into a book and then going over every sentence and every paragraph and everything. I mean, that really was
he rewrote it.
Yeah,
he said he rewrote everything at least 13, 14 times or something like that. So, and it's not an easy read, it's still clunky, I'd say. It doesn't flow like definitely doesn't flow like a textbook. It's philosophical. I think at around page 100 is kind of when he finally drops his hypothesis, and it takes him 100 pages to build up to that point. So, and it's just argumentation for at least that many pages,
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that. Jordan Peterson is really good at mediating between the two areas of the between order and chaos for one, but also between the very rigid academic world and the somewhat more malleable what would you say, democratic world or the general populace, the world of the general populace. And it's funny because even this book plays out something like that. When I picked it up, I was thinking this might be a little bit more of the what your standard academic text with very dry sentences that spell out very objective things. And it is that. It's definitely it's a pretty rigorous read, and integrates a lot of academic ideas for sure. It has its place there, but there is it's interesting how he brings in stories and thoughts and helps you guide you through where he was thinking and how he was taking the journey. So it's definitely a high level read, but there is something. It's unique because it is branching those worlds again, where it's not just the simple academic text. There's also the journey as he's taking you through and trying to get you to understand and work through it.
Yeah. I mean, when I read it, I was 23, 24.
Solid.
I was. So this was back in 2017-ish. And when I was, I had stumbled across Jordan Peterson just because I wasn't going to college at the time. I had to defer for a few semesters, and I was like, well, I might as well learn something while I'm at it. And I had heard about Jordan Peterson as a person, not as a political person, but like just a professor who puts his lectures online. And I was like, oh yeah, okay, great. I'll watch those because free education, you know. And then I remember I put on his Maps of Meaning course, his 2017 course. And I remember listening to the first lecture and I was like, this is heavy stuff. Like this is
Yeah, for
not
sure.
like, you know, an easy subject. Um, and so I said, okay, I think I'm going to wait before I read the book. I'm going to watch Maps of Meaning first. And then I had to like even backtrack further. I'm like, okay, I'm going to take his personality course first and then his Maps of Meaning lecture, and then I'll buy the book. So by the time I read the book, I was able to follow along a little bit more. But the beginning of the book, like it starts out with like a religious quote. The dedication is a verse in Luke um, about basically Christ unfolding mysteries, and then he talks about like kind of like his upbringing, and so like kind of exactly like you said, like he ties it into like a personal story, that's something he's very passionate about. And he
Yes.
talks about like his upbringing, like growing up as a teenager in Canada, and like being
Yes.
sort of like disillusioned with like the liberal like socialist party in Canada. So just instantly I think people could relate. And he talks about like his time as a, you know, working in a prison as a, you know, as a master's student. And so it seems pretty down to earth. And then but then it does go like way deep into like analysis and argument, and
Yes.
you know, he draws from a lot of different sources. But it's nice that he like peppers in like stories and myths and religion, and like when you read the intro you think it would be more political, but that's almost kind of like on the side, like it's like it's an undertone through the thing.
Exactly. Yes. The intro is a very personal story. Jordan Peterson is basically saying, yes, I personally have been trying to figure this out. And essentially, he says, he even talks about some of the changes he made in his life as he's going through this journey, right? Where um, one of the best ones is the little voice in his head where he says, I'm
Mm-hmm.
going to tell the truth from now on. And he found out that almost everything he was saying was false. And so this was part of the process as he was going through and understanding this. And the book is literally, it's essentially what he says in the intro. The book is basically his journey through that at a macro world scale. It's his
Mm-hmm.
personal journey, but at a world scale that other people can go on.
Yeah, definitely. So when I read Maps of Meaning, well, okay, when I saw the lectures, um, when I saw his personality lectures, early on, he talks about the story of Jonas and the whale, and he kind of gives like his interpretation on that, which is really good. You can definitely find it on YouTube. But when I heard that, I was like, oh, this guy's like really thought provoking, really interesting. He's like, you know, he was sort of taking the story like seriously, you know, like I kind of felt like I was in a high level like Sunday school class. Is kind of how I felt when he was talking about Jonas and the whale. I was like, oh yeah, this is what I wish. This is how I wish Sunday school would be like, you know, where people would explore like the stories in that way. Because it's when he talks about Jonas and the whale, like he doesn't necessarily tie it to psychology. Anyways, you guys can go watch the video on YouTube, but he's more about talks. He talks more about like the values that the story presents. So, you know, like one of the way he explains it is like, you know, if you're Jonas in the story of Jonas and the whale, and you're called by God to cry repentance to Nineveh, it's like you're being called by the highest good to aspire to that and to bring others like along with you. And it's like, yeah, like that, those are like values that like, especially as Latter-day Saints, you know, explicitly, you know, in the articles of faith, you know, we seek after good things. And so for him to phrase it that way, like really opened up that story for me that way. And I was like, okay, this is interesting. I'm hooked. And then so then as I read Maps of Meaning or when I watched his lectures on Maps of Meaning, like I instantly started seeing connections between like what we believed as Latter-day Saints. And then when I read the book, like he explicitly makes like the case, like, I'm trying to explore like why there's a divide between like science and religion, and how do we bridge those two,
You're saying that's you, or that was Jordan Peterson?
Oh no, Jordan Peterson. That was his
That
like
was Jordan
explicit
Peterson.
goal in his intro, yeah. And that's all throughout his lectures. Like he's trying to really explore like why those are like discriminated, and then like how they can be bridged back. And so, anyways, yeah. So as a Latter-day Saint, I was like, okay, this is like really worthwhile to like watch this, to like listen to this, and to read this. And then as I read Maps of Meaning, I mean, you could argue like I approached it with like kind of a biased lens, which is true of everyone. But the arguments on their own, I think, are just like really good. The points that he makes are just really good. So I think, I mean, I definitely gained something from it. And so I hope that as we, talk about this book, we can like connect the points for other Latter-day Saints as well.
For sure. Yeah, I'll add just one thing on top of that. Jordan Peterson, one thing he does really well is he takes the scriptures and he says, this has some sort of intrinsic value, and I don't know what it is yet, and I'm going to figure it out. And it's that combination of valuing it deeply and also admitting that we don't know what that is yet. That I think we find, at least in the church, for example, it's very refreshing, and we have a lot to learn from that kind of attitude.
Yeah, 100%. I totally agree. I think approaching, well, when he did his biblical lectures there, he said he was sort of approaching the Bible with like a beginner's mind.
Yeah, and exactly.
And I think, yeah, like go read your scriptures that way again, even though you've been a member for 20, 30 years.
We all have to discover, what was it? Who said that? We all have to take steps towards Calvary. We all have to rediscover the atonement and the sacrifice. We all need to rediscover and recommit as Latter-day Saints to that. And that's just the exact same attitude that Jordan Peterson's doing.
100%. Yeah. All right, sweet. Well, I guess we'll just dive into some of the tidbits that we've been sharing in our Lobster group.
Yeah, let's do this.
We'll talk about the quotes. I mean, I wish we don't have time to read all 600 pages, but
I mean, night's still young, right?
All right.
I mean, it might take more than one night. Okay, fine. We'll just do the quotes tonight.
Yeah. So most of the quotes you posted in the Lobster group, and people have discussed them, and I think like they're heavy quotes. Like they're not how do I explain it? They're not like zingers on Facebook. So like it's a lot to sort of unpack. So I guess we'll just get started on a few of them and see how far we can get.
Sure. Page 154 in my version. I think my version's a little bit of an older version, so it might be a little bit different, but see also figure 32. The unknown as such surrounds all things, but exists only in a hypothetical state and finds representation in symbolic form as the Ouroboros, as we have seen. The disintegration or division of the Ouroboros gives rise to all things, including the disorder or unpredictability that is defined in opposition to what has been explored. And then there is another quote on the Ouroboros as well that I threw in. So here's an interesting divide that I would call what we don't know. Excuse me, let me try this again. So this is my comment. Here is an interesting divide that I would call what we don't know, that we don't know, which is the Ouroboros, and what we don't know, and just what we don't know, or the figure of the Great Mother. Agree, disagree? So yeah, so this came from what, page 154? And the Ouroboros just like completely fascinates me because it's a super ancient idea. It shows up all over the place. It shows up a lot of the time as a snake or a dragon. Mm-hmm. And it's like the what would you say? It's like that primordial, that really raw primordial unknown.
Yeah.
The unknown that you can't even know because it's so deep down there that the minute I mean, to process it is to take it out of the Ouroboros, and to not process it is to be in the Ouroboros. Anyway, I can't show it on the thing, but there's this great diagram, figure 32. And Jordan Peterson says, novelty, the great mother as daughter of the Ouroboros. And so essentially,
Okay, yeah.
what he's pointing out here is that we've got this, we've got this concept of order and chaos, and you can show some act, or what would I say, the creative and the exploratory versus the structured is what I really should say. And the creative and the exploratory is many times it's given a feminine archetype. What was his name? Some fancy guy, I think his name was Eric Neumann, who Jordan Peterson quotes extensively. He diagrammed this out as well. But so that's the creative or the exploratory. And then underneath that, there's something even deeper, which is essentially the mother of the creative or the exploratory, which is this idea of the Ouroboros. So there's a lot there. The Ouroboros is something that I'm constantly trying to figure out. Obviously, the Great Mother, Eric Neumann wrote a multi-100-page book on it. So we could talk all night about this one single quote.
Yeah. Okay, so there's a few interesting tidbits in here for sure. So you have the diagram that Jordan Peterson kind of shows, and I'll put this in the video, but those who can't see it because they're listening, through audio, you basically have like a guy, it's like God the Father, and then like the Great Mother, and then you have like the exploratory hero or the son.
Right.
And then like surrounding all that is like the Ouroboros. And okay, so here's a few things we have to unpack. So the order versus chaos idea, is a Taoist idea. I think most Latter-day Saints would say, well, why would we even care about Taoism as Latter-day Saints? And Hugh Nibley makes a great case for this, and he points out that the Book of Mormon is situated around 600 BC, which is around the time when the axial revolution occurs. And the axial revolution is when like the major world religions that we know today sort of spring forth, and the philosophy, the Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy that we're familiar with and find like deeply relevant kind of springs forth. And that includes Taoism. And evolutionary thinkers have argued that, a lot of these religions and philosophies, they have a lot of similarities and a lot of confluence between each other. And so a lot of evolutionary thinkers are saying, well, what if the actual revolution is just simply like a human response, like evolutionary response or adaptation to their environment? And that's why we came up with all these ideas. And so when you take that into account, Taoism, as a philosophy, is emerging around the same time as like the Book of Mormon and the changes that are happening in Judaism, and then like Greek philosophy is just around the corner, and Hinduism and Buddhism, all these things are happening all around that time frame. And so to because this is an axial thing that Nibley points out, it's like those things are then like connected to we're connected to that tradition now, like with the Book of Mormon being situated right there when Lehi and Nephi and Lehi leave Jerusalem. So from a philosophical standpoint, like that puts a stake in the ground, like right along with everyone else. And I think it should be taken seriously, just as we take those philosophies seriously. Okay, so then you have chaos versus order. And it's really interesting because what I hear in Latter-day Saint discussions is like, well, we don't know that much about Heavenly Mother, and why is Heavenly Mother such an unknown to us? And it's like the symbolism is right there. It's like Jordan Peterson points it out. It's like within the order versus chaos idea, the Great Mother is unknown, and then beyond that is like the Ouroboros, and that's that's like potential. It's like pure potential. Like it's what we it's you know, there's what you don't know in relationship to what you know, and then there's like what you don't know in relationship to what you don't know, you know, like
Exactly.
you don't know what you
Exactly.
don't know. And so when we talk about Heavenly Mother, we can only talk about her in terms of what we know, and that's about it.
Which is
And the
interesting. Cutting back to your Tao, speaking of the Tao, like
yeah,
the Tao that can be spoken is not the true Tao, right?
right, yeah.
And so the same tradition is wrestling with this idea that there's these things of what would you say, eternal and of intrinsic significance, and they are so what would you say, beyond our spoken experience, that they exist and they're of incredible worth and value, but they're of such worth and value that we can't even speak it. We can't even approach it with our language yet.
Right. Yeah, definitely. So, yeah, I found this to be like extremely relevant to Latter-day Saints. I mean, I don't know about other Christian denominations. I mean, the Catholics have, you know, a feminine icon figure, you know, the
Yeah,
Virgin
I
Mary.
mean, most of the I believe that most of the diagrams from Maps of Meaning come from Catholic art from the Catholic tradition. So,
Yeah.
that very strong. It's very interesting. We need to be careful so that like we don't get like hung one day by one sect or the other. Either
Sure.
the Mormons will decide to hang us, or the Catholics will decide to hang us. But what was I going to say? Oh yeah, it's interesting how there's that need for the divine feminine, right? And for that representation, all the different archetypes and representations that represents. And so, the Catholics found that in one way, and now us as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we're exploring that in another way.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And so to me, you know, I thought, like, seriously, it was just so gripping. Like, it was like, to me, I was like, when I was reading Maps, I was like, how does he know this? You know, like, how did he figure this out on his own? It seems. So that was really cool. And when you read Maps of Meaning, like, you just are hit with these lines. You're like, how did you know this? I thought only Latter-day Saints like were talking about this. And to be honest, like, no one was really talking about this until Jordan Peterson sort of came to fame. So it's really interesting. Anything else before we move on to the next quote?
No, I think that's pretty good.
Cool.
Let me navigate over. Let's see if I can do this. Chapter 2, page 176. Ritual sacrifice was an early variant of the idea of heroism, of belief in individual power, the acting out of the idea that voluntary exposure to the unknown constituted a necessary precondition for the emergence of the beneficial goddess and for continued successful adaptation. I think I'm going to have to hold this one open again. I noticed in the my commentary underneath, I remarked on this because Sam Harris, in those famous debates discussion really between him and Jordan Peterson, he was just kind of horrified at the idea of sacrifice. And Jordan Peterson was basically like walking him through that. If I recall right, he said something along the lines of, the civilization is like, what do you give to make what is the best thing that you can give? And, well, do I give my apples? Do I give my goats? Do I give my home? And you get to the point where it's like, well, you give your whole life if you really mean it, right? And Sam Harris was really, he was really struggling with that, trying to figure out what that meant. It would be good to understand the meaning of sacrifice better. It comes from Latin, sacer and facere, which means to make something holy. This is something like we leave in the shallows during church lessons. Oh yeah, it caught my attention as well, because I think that the church is trying to understand what sacrifice means. This might have been this was a talk in the last general conference. Come to think of it.
It was a talk in the last general conference. And
so check this out. September 2nd, Sam Fisher. I knew what sacrifice was before it was cool. I want that on for the record. That was
Yeah,
pure
yeah, yeah.
inspiration right there.
I was listening to that conference talk. I was like, oh yeah, like I know this, and I'm like, I think I read this in Peterson's book. So
What
yeah,
you
it's
don't
very
know is
cool.
that general authority, he's actually following our group.
Is he
And
what?
he read that, what's it called? He read that quote and he was like, that is so good. I'm going to put it into my talk. So that's the claim
Yes.
to fame. No,
Yeah.
that did not happen at all.
um, let's see here. Okay, let me read this over again, and then also, yeah, I'll go ahead and read this over. Give me 1 second though. Let me just read this.
It's interesting while you're reading it. I'm just looking at it. He characterizes sacrifice as the acting out of the idea of voluntary
okay.
exposure to the unknown, which is just interesting.
Okay, so I really like this because it, like when you think about sacrifice, it's like you don't know how it's going to play out. You just don't. Like you can sort of like you might feel good about like certain investments and sacrifices, but at the end of the day, like, do you really know if it's going to pan out? And like, but what I like about this is it's a necessary precondition for the emergence of the beneficial goddess, right? So tying that back to the previous quote, goddess or the feminine figure is like the unknown, it's potential, and it's you have to always remember when you read Peterson that but with both feminine and masculine representations, there's positive and negative. There's positive and negative like valences to those images,
Yes, very much so. Yeah, that's really important to keep in mind.
Yeah, so I don't think that criticisms of Peterson where he's being discriminatory or like sexist or something, I don't think they're totally valid because he does like he highlights both negatives and positives of both
which is
masculine and
fun.
feminine representations. Yeah,
It's so funny because one of my quotes, I don't think we'll get to it tonight, but really quickly, one of my quotes is about how he says ideology is basically mythos in part, right? It's an unformed myth. And
well, let's put a pin
essentially
on that.
That's what's happening, right? Is when they try and pigeonhole Jordan Peterson into like, oh, he said feminine does this, so therefore he's saying women are evil. Like literally that's playing out. Jordan Peterson is saying, no, the feminine has multiple dimensions, positive and negative, and different ways to manifest it. And they're taking an unformed conception of one small part of that and then trying to pillory for it. So it plays out literally in these debates very clearly.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Well, let's put a pin on that
Sure.
that quote because what's his name, John Streeter? He was talking about this, and he has a channel that's pretty popular, and he's an ex-Mormon in our group, and so I think, and he had some questions about that, so I definitely want to address that.
Yeah, we can jump to it next.
Yeah, but so when you do a sacrifice of any kind, it's like you're taking what you already have, kind of what you're already familiar with, you're sacrificing it, throwing it in the fire, giving it up, or making it holy, and like you don't know how it's going to play out, but like that's really the only way, like it said, that's the only precondition, that's the precondition by which like anything positive can result. Like you have to take risks in life. It's just a part of life. You have to be willing to take risks, and like you can do your best to calculate risk, but like you don't have the omniscience to like calculate it perfectly. And so that's a big theme of Jordan's lectures, pick your sacrifice, because you're gonna have to sacrifice one thing eventually, one thing or another, and you might as well choose what that is, and what the and make a decision about what that's going to be. And like when he talks about it, I don't know if you got into this part of the book yet, but he talks about the hostile brothers as an archetype. That's Cain and Abel. And basically that's a story about two different people who gave two different sacrifices that had two different results. And then not only that, but they each had two different responses to that sacrifice. And so, I think that's a valuable lesson, just a practical, valuable lesson about risk. And I like that, he's saying this is being represented in stories and myth. And like sacrifice is such a huge part of Christianity and Judaism and part of our culture.
Indeed.
So it's definitely part of of our experience. I don't. So the Latter Day Peace Studies group, Shiloh Logan and others, they don't like the idea of like sacrifice because it's transactional.
Which
But
I think is most likely a misunderstanding of what sacrifice really means.
Yeah, I think so too, because it misses that nuance that you don't have a guarantee when you sacrifice, whereas in a transaction you do. And I think, but to their credit, approaching sacrifice in a transactional way is like the wrong way to approach it, because again, you don't have a guarantee, and it's like it's an act of faith to sacrifice.
Yes, an act of faith in being. It ties really well to the idea. Jordan Peterson says, when you speak the truth, it's an affirmation that you believe that what has been created is good, and that if you can describe it as best you can, that will be the best thing you can do. It's the same thing with sacrifice. Sacrifice is basically dedicating your time and your talents and everything you have to whatever is the highest good that you can possibly do, right? To make something holy, to do what is holy or good or the best.
Right. Yeah. Well, awesome. Cool. All right. Let's go hit that other one, the other quote, and then we can talk about that.
Chapter 2 is so long and maps.
Yeah, it's super long. Yeah.
It's so long.
I think there's only 3 chapters, but.
All right. Here's the spiciness. Page 216, chapter 3. Ideologies may be regarded as incomplete myths, as partial stories whose compelling nature is a consequence of the appropriation of mythological ideas. And there's a ton more. And this quote, like, he goes on for a paragraph. I wanted to put the entire paragraph down. I said, obviously, this was a humdinger for me. That totally explains it. It's like the myths died, can't support society, so the people need something new, but it comes out unformed, almost like a myth in Ouroboros, more pre-cosmogonic than the myths they earlier rejected.
Cool. Yeah, no, that's such a great quote. That insight in particular was really helpful for me. So in his Maps of Meaning lectures on YouTube and his course, he brings up 2 really good examples. He brings up like the Hobbs versus Rousseau dichotomy. You have Rousseau, who's kind of like this romantic thinker who's like, yeah, nature is wonderful and life-giving, and it's society that corrupts us, and we would all be pure in our natural state, whatever, or in the state of nature, I think is kind of how he puts it. And then Hobbes, on the other hand, is like the opposite of that. And he says, no. Like, we're savages in the state of nature. We're like ripping each other's heads off, and we're unsocialized, and we're like, violent. But then, society essentially domesticates us and tames us. And now we have like an organized, functional society because we have a culture, and we're not in the state of nature. And so those 2 like philosophies are obviously at ends with one another.
Very much. So,
and then like the in social science there's like the nature versus nurture debate. What shapes us more? It's like the answer is it's both, and to what degree, like, we're not entirely sure because the 2 are just intermingled. But when you hear about like popular ideologies throughout history, like in American history in particular, just because we're both Americans, so we can talk about them because we're familiar with them. Like the idea of like the colonizers when they came over to the New World. For them it was like it was a land that had to be like tamed and like conquered and we had to impose our will onto it and till it and cultivate it, but then the environmentalists are like, no, like you're like raping the rainforest,
Destroying it all.
yeah, and you're desecrating like this, living earth, and like in Maps and Meaning, he points out like, okay, like, yes, like nature is beautiful and it's life-giving, but it's also malaria and disease and hunting and preys and prey
Yes.
and predator, and so that's the more balanced view of what's going on. And then when Peterson talks about the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, it's like, yeah, like society gives us a structure and things are predictable, but also it can become tyrannical and bloodthirsty, and we become too socialized, and we just, we follow in goose step with everyone else and commit atrocities.
Yeah, it's funny because Hitler was a strange paradox on this, where he was telling all of the people that he wanted to unloose the beast in them, right? Get them back to raw primal nature. But the way he did that was through extreme rigor and structure and what you said, goose steps. So it's a strange paradox of how that played out, and also, as you can tell, a very serious, real, and dangerous one when you go down the wrong path on those things.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And so I think I think so. As far as our beliefs and stuff go, I read the Book of Mormon after I read Maps and Meaning, and I said, okay, I'm gonna apply what I. Oh, go ahead. So I said I'm gonna apply what I read, and I'm gonna read the Book of Mormon, and through this lens and see what I get out of it, and then, I see in the Book of Mormon, there's this divide where, the Nephites and the Lehi, the Lamanites, excuse me, are like in these two camps, and they each have like their story. Mm-hmm. Like there's a part in I think it's in Alma where, I think Captain Moroni is like fighting against the Lamanites, and he asked him like, why are you fighting against us? And the Lamanites say it's because your ancestors stole our land from from their brother, and now we're just stealing it back, and you guys deserve this, and it's like, well, that's not how Nephi describes the story. And Nephi describes the story as, I'm the righteous brother and I am the king, and I fled my brothers and became king over my tribe, and so like that story becomes like exactly like that quote, like it becomes one-sided.
Yes, very much so.
But anyway, so go ahead.
I was going to say that point you bring up is just so interesting, because we do that at multiple layers, where we take a very complex story, and then we what would you say, basically idealize it, or ideologue. I don't know. I'm going to create a new word here, a new verb or something. Sure. Anyway, ideologize. There we go. The Lamanites were like, and it's so interesting too. You see the pattern of how the Book of Mormon antagonists stir them up to anger, and they get them really angry, and they use that to control them and simplify the narrative. The basic narrative is these people wronged us, and we need to take back whatever they wronged us for, and then they justify pretty terrible things using that, right? Taking out cities, slaving people, all the chaos that ended up in their destruction. So they were basically being pitted against one another using ideologies. In the same way, sometimes we do that with the Book of Mormon. We try and simplify it into a very simple good versus evil, which doesn't actually play out all that well, because the Nephites had plenty of problems. Case in point, they were the ones who got completely wiped out, right? And the Lamanites had plenty of problems too. They were the ones who did the wiping out. That's definitely a problem as well, right? So, but it's interesting because the prophets in the Book of Mormon, many times they're the ones who are trying to help the people to break out of simplifications. Some really great examples that came to mind while you were talking were Jacob, for example. He's like, look, so we've got the scriptures and the promises, and we're keeping the law of Moses, and we're industrious, so that's great. But I mean, the Lamanites, they have a way better family structure. They love each other better. They work with each other better. I think it plays out with the Ammonites. When you listen to the Ammonites, they seem more congenial with each other through the writings, and also a lot more grateful to God. So Jacob's basically saying, look, we can't just say Nephite's good, Lamanite's bad. He's literally helping us to walk through and understand this. Same thing with Alma, for example, when he goes to the preach to the poor among the Zoramites. The poor have been fed this very simple narrative of like, the righteous go to this place and they essentially praise the fact that they're so great. And Alma's like, no, this is a complicated thing. I mean, Alma 32 is essentially him wrestling through and saying like, let's just start with the basics here. Like, you've actually got to, it's not about saying how great you are. It's about wrestling with God and getting revelation. And the whole talk about faith is about receiving revelation from angels, men, women, children. He's like, these are going to come to you in all these things. And when you see these things, that if you have a desire to understand these things, it will grow into your soul. And so he's basically walking them through and saying like, this is a discovery process that has a lot more aspects than we're great because we're righteous, which is obviously wrong. So, and there's many other examples as well. It's so funny because as you were talking, it's just so obvious that the same thing plays out in the Book of Mormon, and then it plays out between us and the Book of Mormon. It happens at multiple levels.
Yeah, definitely. No, that's such a great insight. So I really appreciated this comment by Jonathan here. It says, myths are incomplete myths. When does someone get to say a myth is complete or not? Myths are ideologies too. I'm confused. Okay, so that's a valid question. But I think Jordan Peterson like answers this question. I mean, he answers it kind of like in the quote itself. But there's another quote you have, I think, that explains it further. But basically, Jordan Peterson basically says like there's a grammar to like the greatest myths. Like they have components, because the grammar analogy is kind of hard to wrestle with, because we don't, who the heck thinks about grammar, but
right, yeah.
But it's like in order to make a sense of a sentence, the words have to be put in the right order, and then it makes sense. And so when things are put and if you take any of those words out, then the sentence either changes meaning completely or it doesn't make sense. And so the myths are like that, where Peterson argues like that these myths have imagistic components to them. Like there are certain representations that kind of have to be there for the myth to be like complete and whole, or if it's missing a piece, then it's like a one-sided ideology. And so I really like that. Like, so I think Jonathan in this case, I mean, he can respond to this if he wants to. He'll probably blast us on his YouTube channel, but he's nicer than that, so I'm sure he'll respond thoughtfully. But it's like I think he's talking about myths like, you know how like when you let's say, for example, you're in Egypt and you like dig up a manuscript of like some sort of a ritual, right? Well, that's a myth, and you don't know how complete that record is or how many times it's changed over time.
Sure.
And so that's a valid question. Like, how complete or incomplete is this myth? We don't really know. They're ancient. The oral tradition is even more ancient than the written account. So can you trust any of it? And Jordan basically says like, you can trust it, to an extent, and then you can sort of judge the quality of the myth by its its grammatical structure, let's say, does it include these parts? And he refers to the archetypes to sort of inform him what the grammar is. It's like, does it have a positive and negative masculine figure? Does it have a positive and negative feminine figures? Does it have a positive and negative heroic individual, or I guess the opposite of that, villain, I guess, right? And then does it have the Ouroboros, the sort of the unknown around it? And he gives the example that he gives in Maps of Meaning is the example of the founding myth of Egypt with Horus and Osiris and
Isis
Isis, yeah, and right, exactly, and it has all those parts, or at least most of them, and then he is able to extract from that, like, what the Egyptians were trying to kind of get at with these stories, and you can watch him explain that on YouTube as well on Maps of Meaning, in his Maps of Meaning lectures, but take that back. Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to just build in on what you're saying. The myths is incomplete myths. He does have a point, but like you said, when you're looking at these myths, there's that idea of like reaching out beyond yourself. And Jordan Peterson is basically identifying those elements where people are reaching out beyond and saying, like, they're struggling and wrestling with these ideas versus the ideologies. Right. They either focus on one single small part, or they really, the problem with ideology is it says we know what we need to know and we don't need to know more.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think that idea was really thought provoking. And then when I read the Book of Mormon, the first thing you read that everyone like remembers is Lehi's dream. And, that's such a significant, okay, this is going to blow your mind. So Lehi's dream. Okay. So just so you know a little bit about me, like I love anti-Mormon critiques. I love like reading that stuff. Nice. And like watching videos, and like I have a lot of ex-Mormon friends. Okay.
You're the person I've been warned against. I don't think I can associate with you, sir.
Right. Exactly. Hide your kids, hide your wife. Anyway, so when I approach the Book of Mormon, I try to approach it from like a critic's mind,
Interesting.
And one of the criticisms that I hear over and over, which is actually kind of valid, well, it's all so one of the criticisms is that the Lehi's dream, people believe that he plagiarized that from a dream that Joseph Smith's grandfather had, which is really very similar. Yeah. And like the dream has certain elements, like instead of an iron rod, it's like a rope that he follows. And
interesting.
And there's like a wasteland. And so the dreams are similar. And it's very interesting. And, okay. So going back to Jordan Peterson's lectures on Maps of Meaning, go watch them. But there's a dream that he explains that his son had. And I'm going to put the image on the video so y'all can see. But in the image, it's like there's a river. And then up above the river, there's like basically like a heaven and like a tree. And then I think so there's a river. And then on one side of the river, there's like a bunch of little cottages and like little buildings. And then on the other side is like wasteland and like nothingness. Nice. And then up on the top, there's like a little heaven with like a golden gate and like the sun. And like, if you think about that dream, from an imagistic point of view, it's basically the same, right? It's like instead of a big, large, great and spacious building, it's just a lot of little buildings, and then there's the river in the middle, and then there's the wasteland on the other side, and then at the end, once you follow the river, there's basically heaven. That's like the oasis or the tree of life, and the place where you're supposed to get to. It's like it's the same dream essentially, more or less. And so then he, in Maps of Meaning, there's a diagram where he explains, I think it's like a Swedish like myth, that a representation of a Swedish myth that has like the tree of life and like a river and like all these things. And so it's like this dream is archetypal, and like, if it's archetypal, then many people have had it, have imagined it. And and so it's like, okay, so it doesn't resolve the core issue of did this dream get plagiarized, right? But it opens it up to say, well, this dream is so relevant that you have to take it seriously anyway.
It's part of the shared heritage. It's
exactly.
Part of the shared heritage.
Exactly. And so it's like it's now bigger than just Joseph Smith's like grandpa's imagination. It's like much bigger. It's like global. It's like a part of the collective unconscious. And so
yes, it's a door into the discovery of what reality really is.
Yeah. And like the Lehi's dream is, one of the most memorable and the most meaningful accounts in the Book of Mormon, and for good reason, because it's archetypal and it has these representations. It has the Ouroboros, and it has the negative aspect of order and the negative aspect of chaos, and then also like in between is the positive, the balancing of the two. You have the tree of life, which is a positive representation of nature, and the iron rod is a positive representation of order, that leads you along this path.
Yes. Not to beat this to death. I think I'm probably overreaching on the metaphor here, but it is interesting that, right, it's on the tree of life vision takes place on a plane that is filled with mists of darkness, which is basically like the
Ouroboros.
Right, the Ouroboros, the unknown. And then you've got what would you say, the parasitical order or the tyrannical order in the form of the building and of the loftiness of the world. And then you've got the more creative, positive, and exploratory order, I guess you would say, through the, like you said, the iron rod and the tree of life.
Yeah, definitely. So it's like you have to grapple with that now at that level, and I think the Book of Mormon, like I said earlier, like it's putting its stake in the ground in that axial tradition, and so it's a deep book. It's a book that you really have to wrestle with, and I think Jordan Peterson's like Maps of Meaning sheds a lot of light on it. And I think he gets a few things like, there's so many instances where he like touches kind of what we believe, that, and the reason why I find it significant is because like among the Christian organizations, we're kind of the oddballs, we kind of have like beliefs that most other Christians don't have, like we reject creation ex nihilo, and we, the Heavenly Mother, and extra biblical teachings, in scripture and canon. And Jordan Peterson, when he quotes scripture, 50% of it is like Gnostic texts. And so I don't know how Christians like love him, because you would think they would be upset at him, for not sticking to the Bible. But
you can tell there's a healthy tension between a lot of the Christians, right? I mean, a lot of it's just because they're like, well, join our side, say God exists, right? Or you believe in God, really, I should say. But there's kind of a loving tension between many Christians and Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, I totally agree. Let's see. Do you got time for one more, or?
Yeah, let's chase one more.
All right. Towards the end of the book, he says, he talks about the brothers Karamazov and the problem of evil and suffering. And
he ends with the hostile brothers. That's so interesting. Anyway.
Great chapter. So he talks about the brothers Karamazov. He talks about evil and the problem of evil and suffering. And in the brothers Karamazov, he talks about what Dostoevsky did is he actually took headlines from the newspaper that were like circulating at the time, and he's terrible things that were happening, and he stuck those right in there, for his characters to address, and Dostoevsky sort of does that in a really brilliant way. What Jordan Peterson says is he's talking about pain and suffering, and he says, why does this even exist in the first place? And then Jordan Peterson then says, for any game to exist, any game at all, there has to exist preconditions. And if there weren't these preconditions, then you couldn't play the game. And he says, maybe pain is just one of the preconditions for life, for existence, for being, is what he says. And I thought that was very interesting because, you read about, when I was a missionary, people would ask me the same question. And what's the scripture always point to? You point to the one in 2nd Nephi where Lehi says, well, there's opposition in all things. And in order to experience the sweetness, you have to experience what's bitter. And in order to experience pain, you have to experience what's pleasurable. And so Lehi basically states that that's like just a precondition. Like those are the preconditions for existence, is like that there are these opposites, that there's these juxtapositions. And I'm like, yeah, that's exactly right. And when I read Jordan Peterson's argument, like, there exists pain, it's just a precondition to existence. It's like that, to me, I felt that had a lot of confluence with what Lehi was saying. Like, it's just built into reality. Pain and suffering is built into reality so that we can also experience joy. And he sort of like, the book ends around like when he addresses that issue. And so it's a really nice touch to the end. And he talks about like his daughter and how she was suffering from like her, I think she had like arthritis or some sort of autoimmune disease that made her
juvenile rheumatoid arthritis.
Yeah. And so and so he was saying, like, how do you answer to suffering children, for the suffering? And he says, like, basically the whole book, right, is about the unknown and like dealing with what's known and what's unknown. And he says, and death is like, of course, the ultimate unknown. And he says, you face the unknown, try courageously and optimistically, and you pick your sacrifice, and you have one foot in what you know and one foot in what you don't, and that's the most meaningful path forward. And so when it comes to wrestling with like unknown horrors and death, like that's the way to do it, is by like seeking this middle path of meaning, with one foot in what you know and one foot in what you don't know, and order and chaos.
And it's so good too, because this is one thing that I think that we could really, when I say we, as a faith community, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, like the answer to, the what would you say, the summum bonum of the church message is that, yes, you can actually, in facing the pain, right? We were in heaven, we came down, we knew there was going to be pain, there was opposition. This is the place where we work it out. We face the pain, we make the sacrifice, we deal with the opposition. And in doing so, and through the power of Christ, who was able to transcend this, that we too can transcend it. There is a way and a power and a possibility to be able to, what would you say, overcome these things. And that's like the great promise of the gospel of Jesus Christ and of the church, that as we face this thing, that we can overcome, and that there is something beyond that we're shooting for, and that the sacrifice isn't in vain if we keep our eye on it.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Yeah, I totally agree. I think, for me, the restored gospel, the beliefs of the Latter-day Saints, I think is like the most optimistic, the most hopeful, and the most triumphant like theology that I'm aware of, and the most merciful one too. And I think like, by really like it, one of the ways that Jordan Peterson talks about religion is, he says, there's a difference between knowing what and knowing how. And what he means by that is like, you can use propositions to state like what this is, like objectively, like science does, but it doesn't tell you how to act.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a different like type of knowledge. It's a procedural, participatory type of knowing. And the gospel, that's like kind of like what the gospels are grounded in, is like acting, how to act, how to like confront life, and the harshness of what life is. And in my opinion, for it's in Mormonism, when I listen to, or when I read about Joseph Smith and his experiences, and also like what we learn in the temples and stuff, it's like that it's de-emphasizing like the philosophical, like propositional, creedal, assertions of belief, which Peterson sort of kind of like shies away from too. Like he hates it when people pin him to like stating, I believe X, Y, and Z. Mm-hmm. And his favorite go-to is, I act as if God exists. And it's like that, as far as I can tell, like the whole gospel is about like embodying an ethic and acting honorably, virtuously, and like in a morally upright way. So I think you're right. The gospel gives us like the tool set to do that, to act like in that way. So, all right. Well, I think we're going to wrap up here. But yeah, if you feel like you have the brain power, which most of you probably do, like go read Maps of Meaning. It's worth your while. You can get the audiobook too, if audiobooks are like better for you. I think that, okay, I think there may or may not be a copy of Maps of Meaning in our files, in the Lobster group files. I don't know. You guys will just have to check. And then if you guys want additional resources, you can always DM me. So, all right.
Yeah. Well, this was a pleasure, Alejandro. As always, it's always really great to talk with you and all the other members of the community, even some of the trolly ones. But no, it's just been great. Really glad for what you're doing, and give my best to you and your family.
No, yeah, thanks so much, man. Thanks for taking the time to be on the podcast, and likewise, tell your family hi, and that I wish them the best, and we'll hopefully catch up at the Peterson event in March. So that'll be
very nice. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Cool. All right.